Welcome to the podcast series, Ascendem, brought to you by Heidelberg University's Graduate School for Humanities and Social Sciences. Tune in for thought-provoking interviews with experts in different fields, from the social sciences to the humanities, from law to economics. Hello and welcome to the HGGS podcast series, Ascendem. Today, we are going to discuss the topic of energy transition, socio-spatial tensions. Today, humanity is confronted with one of the most pressing challenges in its history, climate change. While there is a broad consensus on the need for urgent action, it would be difficult to argue that we have collectively done enough to address the challenges posed by climate change. In this context, the transition towards renewable energy sources, such as solar and wind power, has become one of the central pillars of efforts to reduce dependence on fossil fuels and create more sustainable future. Yet, energy transition projects are often far more complex than they initially appear. The development of renewable energy infrastructure frequently transforms landscapes and affects the lives of people who maintain deep social, cultural, and economic ties to these territories. As a result, such projects involve a wide range of stakeholders, competing interests, power relations, and, at times, significant social conflict. Nevertheless, these changes should not lead us to pessimism. Rather, they offer an opportunity to better understand how sustainable transformations can be designed in a socially just and inclusive manner. To help us navigate this complex and highly relevant topic, we are delighted to welcome Professor Rosa Lehmann, Professor of Innovation and Sustainability in Ibero-America at the Heidelberg Center for Ibero-American Studies at the Heidelberg University. Welcome, Professor.
Thanks for the invitation. I'm happy to be here.
Well, we are also really glad to have you today. And I'd like to start with asking your academic background.
Well, to not have it too long, maybe just quickly, I started to study political science and anthropology at Freiburg University. That's also where I did my master at that time. And it tells you a bit how old I am. It was still called Magister. We didn't have the separation between bachelor and master back then. And during my studies, I got very much interested in human rights work, land conflicts, especially with a regional focus on Mexico. I traveled to Mexico quite a few times and engaged as a human rights observer or doing human rights observation with a human rights organization there. And this raised a bit my interest in understanding land and resource conflicts. And when I finished, and this is because it's linked to my academic background, when I finished my studies, I actually wanted to keep on working on these topics because I discovered, and this is still the fact today, that I have more questions than answers, always. That's part of the research process. So I tried to actually design a project and finally got a scholarship for looking at wind energy conflicts in Mexico. And after finishing my PhD in 2018, I started to work, or I was already working at Jena University in the Institute of Sociology. So I switched a bit from political science, anthropology, critical North-South studies. I was doing my PhD at the Arnold Bergstrasse Institute in Freiburg, which has sort of a focus on trans-regional research. I switched to Jena University in sociology in a project that was very much at the interface of environmental sociology, political ecology. We also worked with a lot of concepts that came from human geography. And we worked on another dimension of transitions and resource use. We worked on the bioeconomy, inequalities, knowledge, etc. I focused on understanding bioenergy and the emerging bioeconomy in Germany. The project got a bit difficult because the pandemic hit the world and I had to redesign a bit my research I wanted to conduct in field, talking to people, doing participant observation because these are the methods I use. And then I got the opportunity during the pandemic to assume this position at Heidelberg University. As you said, I'm Junior Professor Innovation and Sustainability at the HGGS, the Heidelberg Center for Ibero-American Studies, which is an interdisciplinary research center at the interface of humanities and social sciences. I'm also, and this is important for my work, I'm also affiliated to the Faculty of Chemistry and Earth Sciences and the Institute of Geography and to the Heidelberg Center for the Environment. So I have like these three sort of legs. Of course, I don't have three legs, but three affiliations that actually influence what I'm doing, because I'm looking at contestation in transitions to sustainability. I'm working on debates. I'm inspired by debates on socio-ecological transformation, just transition. I'm interested in how sustainability policies, projects, including renewable energies, but also biomass use, mineral use, with the goal to decarbonize and transit to a somehow less fossil future, I would call it like this, how this sort of could reproduce conflicts, inequalities, creates tensions on different scales, local, national, global. I'm also interested at the interrelation between processes and actors and power relations between these scales. And this is what I've been doing in the last years at Heidelberg University.
That's a quite interdisciplinary background, actually. And that also fits with our team, interdisciplinary research. And I'd like to also concentrate on the fact that you served as one of the supervising professors for the topic of energy transition, socio-spatial tensions at the 4EU Plus Winter School Collegio Futuro 2026. And you partly answered actually this question, but maybe more concretely, what was your motivation actually choosing this topic and also working with the young researchers?
Well, the motivation actually to work at the 4EU Plus Winter School probably reflects my general motivation for doing what I'm doing. That is that, as you said in the introduction, we need to decarbonize, we need to transit to some energy sources or resource base that is more sustainable. Although we can discuss that term and critical debates around sustainability are old, I would say. But we have to do that, or like humanity. Some actors more than others, I would say. And this is necessary to mitigate climate change, but at the same time, and I'm absolutely in favor of renewable energies. I want to put this very prominently. So I'm not critical about the technology in general. But I think it's really important to take into account also the tensions that are created around it, because you can frame it as social acceptance, you can frame it as embeddedness of the energy transition in societies. Socio-technical transition is a concept that we use in research, but I would even consider it broad, with the goal to transit to a more sustainable economy, society, renewable energies, and everything we do in that respect. Politicians and actors on different scales needs to navigate that tension, right? That of course there are things that change, there are people that might feel excluded, might feel the costs, and to reflect and openly debate what are these costs, what are these benefits, and to look at that. So I'm not focusing, and this is my political ecology background, not too much on designing policy recommendations, but I'm really interested in understanding why are people against or for something, what is at play, how do people frame certain expectations, what's the historical background of conflicts. I'm not an historian, but I think it's really important to take into account what's the story of a place. Right? What do people bring in their criticism? How do they frame belonging to a place, etc.? And this is sort of the motivation to look at this interface. Socio-spatial means like social relations in space or spatial relations in societies, interrelation between what happens in specific spatialities in relation to the energy transition. And because the Winter School had this kind of overall topic of looking at tensions in sustainability transitions, I thought it's a good idea, and I had a wonderful group that did great work at the 4EU Plus Winter School. A lot of advanced master students, doctoral students, and I think also the output, the case study you did and the policy recommendations you developed for a contested wind energy project in Colombia was also quite intriguing.
Thank you so much for your compliment. And to make this concept, energy transition, socio-spatial tensions, more tangible, could you provide some examples of energy transition projects that you have studied in Ibero America?
Yes, I started with looking at wind energy conflicts in Mexico. I'm still following up on that topic, also solar power projects. Solar and wind are often named as the core technologies for decarbonization or for transiting the electricity system to renewable energies. So I've studied cases in Yucatan and in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in Mexico. I've also engaged a bit, that's not Ibero-America, with debates on and studies on bioenergy and energy cooperatives in Germany. And I have recently engaged with some case studies in Chile, renewable energy projects, also with the goal to produce green hydrogen, but also I studied just transition processes or the coal phase out in Chile and questions around futures for workers, environmental problems, etc.
That make a quite list of socio-spatial conflicts actually associated with these energy transformations. And what forms do these conflicts typically take actually? And do you identify recurring patterns or common dynamics across different cases?
Yes, I could probably carve out a few patterns. So one is that there's always a tension or a contestation around decision making. So who decides on what scale? And what's the temporality of these decisions? That might sound a bit abstract, but it basically refers to different moments when, for example, investors take decision to plan a project, national energy ministries decide, agree to something, and people living in that place where projects are to be implemented get knowledge about that, right? Often this clashes, actually. There has been some change in the last years, and depending on the country context and companies, some policies, regulation from the country itself are more advanced in norms concerning environmental impact assessment or even social impact assessment. Companies have adopted some forms of community managers, like hiring people that engage with communities even before projects are planned. But this is a central tension. And often energy and climate, especially energy policies or politics, are negotiated on the national scale. Climate goals, of course, figure in. You have municipalities and municipal agency, but mostly that's at least what my knowledge is more concerning adaptation and big project because they are investment intensive. They are sort of the earlier decisions are taken on other scales, but not the local municipalities or the comuna. And this is, I think, one pattern of attention. What figures in is that in different countries, especially Latin American countries, you have not only environmental impact assessment regulation or social impact assessment as in Mexico, but you also have the right of, for example, indigenous people or Afro-Latin communities to be consulted, prior informed consent or consultation. That has been adopted in some political regulations of some countries. It's often difficult actually that's a recurring pattern, to put that in practice. Because again, the different temporalities and spatialities figure in, because at what point could you speak of prior, for example? Is it before a company even thinks of investment or before the national energy plan is negotiated in parliament? So this is a problematic. There's a lot of literature on that. And I think an interesting discussion also because it touches core question of how do we organize democracies? What is democracy? Not only participation. What is the content of these consultations, for example? What's the content of agreement between companies, government agencies, and those who are affected? I put that in brackets not to deny criticism, but of course that's also a pattern we discover concerning the question of distribution and participation. Who frames him, herself as affected? Is it the people that still see the wind turbine or only those that hear it? Is it the people on an even broader spatial scale that might benefit from the electricity? Of course, electricity in the grid goes somewhere, but maybe gets a reduced electricity fee. So this is really, really difficult. And I think it touches core question of democracy, of how socio-environmental relations and a transition to sustainability is organized and needs to be organized. I don't have an answer on that. What's also a pattern, because you asked me about pattern, is that we have the moment of urgency. I mean, you had it in your beginning words. That of course there is a sense of urgency, which we can't deny, of mitigating climate change. But of course this clashes with, for example, democratic participation processes. Again, I don't have an answer to that, but I think it's really important to understand that and also understand that this urgency sometimes figures in to legitimize certain pressure maybe, or certain things that need to be done or not. And another, maybe to sum up a bit the patterns, probably there are more. One thing that I discovered more recently, also in close conversation with Latin American colleagues of mine, is that speaking about tensions, what is sort of estimated as more important than others is that environmental issues or things, what happened in places, maybe impacts on socio-environment's livelihoods, is not considered that prominent in regard to renewable energy projects. I'm not only talking about this, what we know from German debates between biodiversity conservation and climate change mitigation, but also, and this is sort of an impression my colleagues share, and I also know from my own research, is that often we have places that were not really important, so to speak, for investment, for doing things. And now these places become very prominent for producing solar and wind energy because before they were disconnected from infrastructures, etc. So there's this notion of local stakeholders. Of course, they are not homogeneous. To also question a bit this narrative of now we are important. Some communities can negotiate really well of getting some monetary benefits, right? I'm not the one to judge that, but we see that in northern Chile, not so much in relation to wind and solar power, also wind power, but mostly in regard to lithium extraction. Communities knew how to negotiate well with companies to get jobs, to get some monetary benefits. But sort of the question, what happens in these concrete places and what actually also stakeholders might have or actor groups might have demanded before in terms of restoring environmental pollution, etc., was not so much on the agenda and in the focus of political decision makers. And now these places become important, and a lot of interest is generated, sometimes only for a short time, because in an investment or if you have a new technology, for example, in relation to green hydrogen, a lot of attention has been in the last years on certain spaces with possibly high production capacities. The hype went down a bit. Talk of southern Chile, other regions of the world went down a bit. And of course, this already had created in the places, in the localities where these projects were to be settled or implemented, has created some fears, concerns, hopes, etc. So I think it's really important to look at what happens in these places. And this is a pattern, right? That also we have this tension of what has been recognized before, what was on agenda of political decision makers, who was heard, and now with a change in energy necessities, policies, for example, the change in Europe influence what happens in Mexico or Chile, nearshoring strategies, etc.
Actually, in this framework of re-evaluating the value of the land that was not actually valuable before, you have conducted a research on the concepts of degraded and marginal land, which are often considered suitable locations for renewable energy projects. But I think there were also problems in determining the value of these lands actually when we take into account the stakeholders, as you have explained. So maybe could you elaborate on that?
Yeah. Well, I haven't worked on, because I'm not a physical geographer nor an expert that knows about soil quality. So I'm not the one to judge if soil or land could be considered as degraded. I just want to call sort of from a critical human geography, social science perspective. And that's what I did in that work you referred to, is to look at the framing around how land is valued, right? Degraded, valuable, the place or the land of traditions and sacred sites. So you have different competing languages of valuation. That's a terminology by the Barcelona School of Ecological Economics, environmental justice work that has been done there. So I think this is interesting to look at. And a pattern, here you have your pattern again. What we see is that in a lot of places, not in all, that become interesting for implementing wind and solar parks, you need a lot of space for that. A lot of places are framed as degraded, empty, marginal. Of course, with the empty land frame, we have sort of also a colonial legacy behind that, I would say. Very problematic. And again, there are also stakeholders, actor groups in these places that would say agriculture doesn't sell anymore. It's getting harder. We need some other opportunities. At least now I get the rent from my land when I put up some solar panels or when I conclude a contract with that wind energy company. But at the same time, and this is what also leads to contestation, there are actor groups that say, although it's harsh and it's getting worse with climate change, we adapted agriculture. We experiment with forms of agroecology. For example, in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, already long ago, the corn, which is a traditional food in Mexico, very mythological, very important. So normally you have high plants of corn. In the isthmus, like the corn plant adapted to the windy conditions, and it's a lot smaller. So you have actors that claim that, of course, you can work with the land, you can sustain livelihoods, subsistence or forms of subsistence for the future is a very important sort of argument for these groups. So for me, it's important to look at how different actors frame land, what's sort of the value for them. Agricultural value, economic value, if you want to call it like this, but also emotions, notions of belonging, place attachment, and they are brought into the debates around projects. So I'm not the one who judges, is this marginal, is this degraded? And I'm not the one who judges, do you have a sense of belonging, do you belong? But I'm looking at how this figures in these contestations.
Well, Thank you so much for your elaboration on this really complex topic. And I'd like to ask more about this concept of just transition, because you have also worked on this concept, just transition, but we are talking about an area, Ibero America, where different cultures actually living together, and also they have different cultural understandings of justice, which could also create challenges when attempting to build consensus around energy transition projects. So would you like to also elaborate on these challenges that comes up with the cultural differences?
Yes, I like to elaborate on that. Probably not so much in reference to cultural differences, but maybe let's start like this. So just transition, I would argue we need to understand it as kind of empty signifier or concept that can be used by different actors also to fill it with meaning, right? So what's justice? Probably if we talk, we have already a different understanding of what's just. And of course, here the diversity and cultural differences, socioeconomic differences also figure in, depending on what you want as an actor group. You have quite different and competing understandings of what could be a just political process, what could be a just recognition of experiences, of histories, etc. So this is important. And this is why sort of my take on just transition is not to say we need to adjust transition. This is why we need ABC, because firstly, I think it's an open process of what's a just transition. I'm interested in how actors understand it, and this was the work I was doing, or is the work I'm doing in Chile, how the just transition strategy, which you now have in some countries across the globe, how they frame it in the political strategy, how different actors actually elaborated that, what's sort of the background, because often these strategies actually build on past conflicts, on past problems that are now reframed with this concept because it gained prominence in the last years. Paris Agreement, the NDCs, the National Determined Contributions, also, for example, in Chile, refer to that, which speaks for me to a tension between how to reconcile social needs, economic well-being, right, and protection of ecosystems and climate change mitigation, etc. So it speaks to an unresolved tension. And this tension is also similar to what we find in debates about sustainability. It's the same idea. You need something for a future, a livable planet. And of course, you have different interests and different factors that clash. So this is my take on just transition. And I think it's really interesting to look also at different proposals and ideas what different actor groups have. But again, I would say it's not something that we should take as fixed or this is a state we can reach. I think it's part of this ongoing negotiation in societies across scale about how do we deal with these current multiple environmental climate crises, etc.
Building on what you have explained on this inclusive decision-making process, and we are also talking about different stakeholders, but some stakeholders are more vulnerable to the consequences of this energy transition than others. For example, indigenous communities or local people that are living there who has more than economic ties to this land that they are living in. So what would be your policy recommendations in terms of creating a more inclusive decision-making process in these areas?
Yeah, good question. Maybe first to talk briefly about local communities and who's affected. So that's very heterogeneous. Of course, there are people that live close to projects that really depend economically on the land. But there are also people that actually welcome these projects because they have a lot of land and they know they can make a lot of money out of that. And that's also understandable. They are also, depending on the region where you are, so local or in the places where projects are set up does not necessarily mean marginalized. I think that's really important. For example, central Chile, you have a lot of solar parks that are set up. Of course, we need to define what's marginality, right? Or what are poverty indexes. But there are also people that commute, that actually live there because they are digital nomads and have their home office and they're relatively well off. So I didn't do a broad social structure analysis, but just to complexify a bit this affectedness, local communities debate. I think it's important to consider what's a spatial scale of influence where people could be affected in one way or the other, and even including aesthetics, if that's the goal. I don't know, it should be a process. But to turn these processes a bit towards the bottom up and not so much top down, of course, then you have the urgency argument. What's experienced and what lots of studies show is that the more ownership people that live near these projects have, like in terms of not only getting monetary benefits, but also being including in decision-making, not only before the projects are to be set up, but also during project phase, via energy cooperatives, via some forms of economic organization that has some ownership on this project, that this creates and enhances acceptance, right? And the sense of people of benefiting, of owning, of supporting. So there's a clear tendency in the literature, depending on context. And in Latin America, you have very different sort of opportunities for example, energy cooperatives, as in Germany or Denmark, where energy cooperatives are part of energy transition history. So in Latin America, you have a totally different history of how energy transition landed or happened. But you have organizations that promote community energies. You have networks that work in that direction. You have some more sort of deregulated forms where it's a notion of you have local entrepreneurs and they install renewable energy projects, and it's not so much embedded in communities or with that spirit. So you have different forms. And I think that's really interesting. Or another can create more notion of ownership, of participating in the energy transition. But of course, the whole process of creating energy cooperatives is very difficult. I don't want to ignore the challenges that are there, but it's a result that we know from scholarship on that.
Well, we are talking about a really complex problem because we focused on Latin America, a region characterized by diverse social, cultural, and political contexts. And you have also mentioned how the economic structure is a little bit different in terms of the companies when we compare it with the other parts of the world. Would you like to name maybe other factors that also differentiates the energy transition projects in Latin America from the other parts of the world?
Well, I could not really distinguish differences between Latin America and like a broad overview comparative study. But what I would also like to say is, of course, that Latin American countries are very different, like diverse. It's a whole region, but it's very huge. But what I found also reading different studies is that, of course, you have some things that I would say from knowing a bit the context in Europe differ. And one is, as I said, sort of the history of the energy transition and the question of who did the first or fought for renewable energies is quite different. So in Germany, the anti-nuclear movement was very important. So there's a whole party that created around that topic. Probably that's very unique. But I think it's also a big difference. And another difference is that in a lot of Latin American countries, you have state-owned fossil fuel companies that are very important for the state budget, for jobs, etc. So coal extraction, oil extraction, Colombia is very important, and Ecuador oil, Mexico oil, etc. And this is, of course, always an argument that governments of these countries bring in negotiations about energy transition, is that as long as you can sell fossil fuels and you depend a bit for your state budget on these royalties or on these rents, it's really hard to sort of actively let go that source of income. Of course, it's a huge complex problem, and you can also use that money to reinvest, and there's tons of literature on that. But I think that's very important as a central difference, for example, to Central and Northern Europe.
As we are talking about a really complex problem, and as you also have a really distinguished interdisciplinary background, I'd like to ask about the importance of the interdisciplinary collaboration in your field, and maybe which disciplines are particularly important for studying energy transition and socio-spatial conflicts.
Well, I think you could study these topics from every discipline you would like. So I think interdisciplinary research for me helped me to approach certain categories or patterns I try to identify through different lenses. Sometimes actually, especially in the Anglo-Saxon literature on that topic, it's really hard to distinguish what's the discipline behind. Of course, authors frame themselves in a discipline and build on scholarship. But if you look, and that's what I sometimes do if I'm interested in the work of someone, but if I look at their academic background, it's often very interdisciplinary. So people working in development studies, before in geography, before in anthropology, and they followed up on that topic and they publish, for example, in a geographical journal. So then the question is, okay, what's the discipline? Maybe there's an educational background, etc. I think what unites sort of the field where I'm in, and this is what I would call human geography, social science, energy studies, or transition studies. What unites is a perspective of that transition is not only a technical process, but you have societal factors that figure in, and you need to understand the power relations, especially the power relations on different scales and the role of different actors, agency, etc. What happens in specific places, etc. These things that we talked about. What I learned from scholars from other fields is to understand, for example, the whole technology behind these, for example, wind and solar power in direct dialogue. But I also tried at some point to understand studies they did. Sometimes it's really difficult. So interdisciplinarity is really difficult. I look up things I don't understand. I look up, for example, a good source, YouTube videos, for example, by the Wuppertal Institute on how green hydrogen is produced. So things that you probably would also do as a student, I also do because it's not something I have an expertise. I learned from more humanities, cultural geography to look at notions of belonging and place identity. But here I could build on my background in anthropology. So I would say there are a lot of overlaps and sometimes it's hard to identify like what's a background. But I think in generally, if you have an interdisciplinary dialogue at least, or are open to what people from other fields say, you discover that you have a lot of similar debates or kind of similar debates in different academic realms. That's also something that I discovered, and people don't know of each other, although they are very close, I think, conceptually and content-wise. But of course, it's a retroalimentation and input for daily work.
And as my last question, actually, I'd like to ask one other challenge, because these kind of problems also have the transboundary aspects, which also requires an international collaboration, both in research and also afterwards finding a solution for this problem. So how would you assess the importance of the international collaboration in your field in terms of the problems that you are trying to research and also then maybe give a solution?
Well, I think it's fundamental to cooperate first with colleagues that work on similar issues and topics in the contexts where you work, and also with students to make contact and collaborate, maybe also with some stakeholder or actors that you study. Of course, when you do qualitative research, you need that contact. It depends a bit on time and money resources, how much you can do that. Maybe that's also important, especially for PhD students. And it's also, I would say, collaboration and networks don't just happen in one event. So I've been working with some colleagues for quite a few years now, with some more recent, but it's also a phase of creating trust and relationship, because at the same time, of course, we have academic discussions. Sometimes we exchange experiences about field research, contacts in the field, etc. So that's very helpful. But not only in Latin America, right? Also in Germany and for research doing here. What I actually would like my colleagues to do at one point is to also study transition cases in Germany or in Europe, because I also think that perspective from different positionalities helps, but not only me going to Mexico or Chile, but also scholars coming to Germany. I had the chance to host a master student in the last weeks from Chile, and she was working on energy cooperatives in Germany. It was really interesting because, of course, she had another access, another perspective on that topic. And I was really fascinated. And she compared it to the Chilean case, and I think worked out not only the differences, but also to understand different transition histories, what we discussed before. And I think that was a really great thing she did. And I think that's something in international collaboration I would actually wish for more in the future, that we have not so much the reproduction of these historical North-South relations, that scholars from the global North, or supposedly the global North, whatever that is, still more resources or partly more resources more naturally go to different country contexts to study in whatever field it is, but also vice versa. And that also scholars from Latin American countries, if they want to study France and Brazil in comparison, but they are from Guatemala, that no one asks them why you're not working in Guatemala. That's something colleagues told me, that they always sort of assume that they work on the country they come from. And I think that's also a bit one thing that in science and in academic perspectives we need to change.
Well, Professor Lehmann, thank you so much for this wonderful, insightful interview. And you have also partly answered my last question, but I'd like to ask you whether you would like to share your maybe actual academic and personal plans, because you have also said that you are wishing to work more on the German context.
Yeah.
But maybe are there any other projects that you would like to work on in the future? And also, what are the actual projects that you are working on?
Well, I have different current projects on question of place and belonging, home, in conflicts around energy transition, on green hydrogen projects, and just transition, as we discussed before. And I want to actually sort of in the next steps, yes, I want to think about what can we learn also from debates on cases in scholarly research in Latin America. What could we learn for the German context and how could we discuss these questions in the German or in the European context closer to here? But I also think it's very important to have this not comparing. I think contexts are really difficult to compare, to study like the questions, the core questions that motivated right from the beginning, my research and my thinking, they are still unresolved, I would say. And I like to study this in different places, and I would love to do that also in the future.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Lehmann, again. And we are closing right now our episode. And if you liked our episode, please don't forget to check our other episodes. And Professor Lehmann and I are saying goodbye to you.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you for listening to the HGGS podcast series, Ascendem. In this series, we bring you conversations with experts from a wide range of disciplines, from the social sciences to the humanities, from law to economics. If you enjoyed our podcast, we invite you to explore our previous episodes and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a new episode. Stay tuned for more insightful interviews coming soon.